I was there when the message came in. I want you to know that before anything else. I was not reading about it the next morning. I was not watching a replay on some screen somewhere. I was standing in the operations room at Lunar Base Callaway, coffee going cold in my hand, when the transmission lit up every board in the building simultaneously, and a voice came through the speakers that was not a human voice, and had never been a human voice, and said, in English so precise it sounded like a machine had learned the language by reading a dictionary and nothing else. You have 24 hours to transmit your unconditional surrender. At the end of 24 hours, if no surrender has been received, we will consider your silence a declaration of war. And then it stopped, and the room was very quiet. And then Sergeant Akafer, who was standing 3 feet to my left with his own coffee going cold in his own hand, said exactly what everyone in that room was thinking. He said, "Are they serious?" And I said, "I think they are." And he looked at the speakers for another long moment, and then he laughed. That was how it started, with Akafer laughing in the operations room at Lunar Base Callaway at 5:47 in the morning, while an alien ultimatum was still echoing off the walls. I want you to understand that he was not laughing because he thought it was funny. He was laughing because he did not know what else to do. Because the thing the Veth-Kari had just done, had just walked up to the species that had been having the worst century in recorded history. A century of wars and pandemics and climate disasters and economic collapses and every other catastrophe you can name. The species that had been through all of that and was still somehow here, still somehow expanding, still somehow building new things out of the wreckage of the old, and told that species that it had 24 hours to quit. That species. 24 hours. The laugh was not amusement. The laugh was the sound a person makes when reality has just said something so profoundly misjudged that the only possible response is a noise that has not been classified yet. Let me tell you about the Veth-Kari, because the story does not make sense without them, and most people, even now, do not fully understand what they were. The Veth-Kari were not conquerors in the traditional sense. They did not want our planet. They did not want our resources. They had access to resources on a scale that made ours look like rounding errors. What they wanted, and this took us several weeks to fully understand because their communication style was precise but their motivations were not immediately legible, was order. They were in the most literal possible sense administrators. They had been administering species in this sector of the galaxy for approximately 40,000 years. Their method was simple. They arrived. They assessed. They classified the species as either a member of the compact, their word for the community of civilizations they oversaw, or as a disruption risk. If you were a disruption risk, you were given the opportunity to submit to oversight. If you refused oversight, you were contained. Contained was a word they used in their communications with us the way a building manager uses the word inconvenience. Technically accurate, significantly understating the reality of the thing it described. They had done this to 612 other species. 612. Some of them had submitted. Some of them had been contained. None of them had laughed. None of them had looked at the 24-hour clock and said, "Well, let's see." None of them had done what humanity did in the first 3 hours after the transmission came in, which was to hold an emergency session of the United Earth Council, argue for 90 minutes about the correct protocol, fail to reach consensus, adjourn temporarily, reconvene with better coffee, and then, and I want you to appreciate this, I want you to hold this moment in your mind for as long as it takes to feel the full weight of it, send back a response that said, "We appreciate your communication and will respond within the specified time frame. Please stand by," and then went back to arguing. The Veth-Kari received this response, and according to the intercepts we analyzed later, spent 4 hours trying to determine whether "please stand by" was a form of surrender or a declaration of intent or some kind of idiomatic expression they had not encountered in their language files. It was none of those things. It was humanity buying time while it figured out what it actually wanted to do. This was not a strategy. It was just how we operated. I spent the first 6 hours of the 24 in the operations room. Then I was transferred to the forward communications post at Relay Station 7, which was closer to the Veth-Kari fleet, and therefore considered by command to be a relevant position. What this actually meant in practice was that I was sitting in a smaller room with worse coffee and a direct line to the council deliberations that mostly involved listening to people argue in 12 different languages about things that were simultaneously the most important and most irrelevant questions anyone had ever asked. Should we surrender? Define surrender. Define the terms. What do they mean by oversight? What do they mean by contained? What precedent does this set? What does international law say about alien ultimatums? There is no international law about alien ultimatums. There should be. Add it to the agenda. Someone actually said that. Add it to the agenda. We had approximately 17 hours left before a species that had administered 612 other civilizations was going to start the process of administering us, and someone put drafting a legal framework for future alien ultimatums on the agenda. I have thought about this moment many times in the years since. I have come to believe it is the most human thing I have ever witnessed. At hour 9, the Veth-Kari sent a second transmission. It was shorter than the first. It said, "We note that you have not yet surrendered. We wish to clarify that our offer is genuine and our timeline is firm. We have administered 612 species in this sector. We are not without experience in these matters. Your cooperation is in your interest. We are prepared to be patient within the specified time frame." There was a pause in the council chambers when this came through. A genuine pause, the kind that happens when a room full of people all process the same thing at the same time and have the same reaction. The reaction was not fear. It was something closer to what Akafar had expressed in the operations room 9 hours earlier. One of the council members, I will not say who because she has since become something of a historical figure, and I do not want to reduce her to this moment, though it is an excellent moment, said into the microphone. They said patient. And another council member said, they did. And the first one said, they think 24 hours is patient. And the room produced a sound that started as a murmur and within about 4 seconds had become something I can only describe as collective. Not quite laughter, something adjacent to laughter. The sound of 6 billion years of accumulated human stubbornness recognizing, simultaneously, that someone had just made a very significant miscalculation. Here is what the Veth-Kari did not know. Here is the thing that their 40,000 years of administering species had not prepared them for, because none of the 612 species they had previously encountered had given them any reason to expect it. They did not know what humans do when you put a clock on them. They had observed us long enough to know our capabilities. They had assessed our technology and our population and our resource base and our military capacity, and had made, from a purely analytical standpoint, a reasonable determination that we were not in a position to resist. They were correct about all of those things. What they had not accounted for, what could not be accounted for without a specific and detailed understanding of human psychology that they did not have because no prior species had required them to develop it, was what happens to a human being when someone tells them they have a limited amount of time to do something they have decided not to do. The clock does not produce compliance. The clock produces acceleration. The clock produces focus. The clock takes everything that was theoretical and makes it immediate and concrete, and the human brain, presented with something immediate and concrete and time-limited, does not shut down. It opens up. It starts running faster. It starts finding options that were not visible before the clock started. The council reached consensus at hour 11. I know because I was on the line when it happened, and I heard the shift in the room. The particular quality of silence that follows a decision after a long argument, which is different from all other silences in the way that the silence after a storm is different from the silence before one. The decision was not surrender. The decision was not war, either. We were under no illusions about what a direct military engagement with a species that had been doing this for 40,000 years would produce in the short term. The decision was something that, in retrospect, was the only thing it could have been given: who we are and how we work and what happens to us when someone tells us the clock is running. The decision was, talk to them, not to negotiate surrender, not to negotiate terms of oversight, to talk, to actually communicate, to find out what they were, what they wanted, what they had seen in 612 other civilizations and what they had not seen, and to be in the conversation exactly what we were, the species. That laughed at the 24-hour clock and then spent 11 hours arguing about legal frameworks, and then, when the time came to act, acted the way we always act, by being so completely and specifically and irreducibly human that the thing on the other side of the table did not know what to do with us. I was on the communications relay when our team made first contact with the Veth-Kari diplomatic interface. There were 3 of them: a linguist named Dr. Yusra Obi, a former ambassador named Marcus Thunes who had spent 30 years negotiating things that most people had said could not be negotiated, and a man I knew only as Garrett, who was introduced in the briefing documents as a specialist in adversarial communication dynamics, and who I later learned had spent the previous decade working in hostage negotiation. 3 people, responding to the representatives of a civilization that had administered 612 species. 3 people, 2 of whom had not slept in 14 hours, and one of whom, Garrett, had apparently requested and received a cheese sandwich just before the transmission began, which detail has always stayed with me as the most grounding detail in the entire encounter. The Veth-Kari diplomatic interface opened by repeating the terms of the ultimatum, verbatim. This, we learned later, was standard procedure. They always began diplomatic contact by restating the ultimatum. It was, for them, a clarifying act, a way of ensuring that any subsequent conversation took place with a shared understanding of the parameters. Dr. Obi let them finish. Then she said, "We heard you the first time. Could you tell us what happened with the others?" The interface paused. This was not a standard response. In 612 prior administrations, no species had responded to the restatement of the ultimatum with a question about prior administrations. The interface said, "We do not understand the relevance of the question." And Thunes, who had 30 years of making impossible things possible and who recognized the specific moment when the other side of a table was slightly off balance, said, "The relevance is that we are trying to understand what you are, not just what you want." The interface paused again. Then it said, "This is an unusual approach." And Thunes said, "We are an unusual species." And Garrett, who had a cheese sandwich and a calm that I found almost alarming given the circumstances, said nothing, which is apparently a very powerful move in adversarial communication dynamics. What followed was not a negotiation. It was something for which I do not have a precise word, though I have been trying to find one for years. It was 3 humans and a Veth-Kari diplomatic interface talking to each other for 6 hours and 47 minutes in a way that neither side had been prepared for, and that produced, in the end, something that neither side had expected. The Veth-Kari had come prepared to administer. They had a protocol. They had 612 reference cases. They had a system that had worked every time it had been applied. What they did not have was a framework for a species that responded to the ultimatum not with submission or defiance, but with genuine curiosity about the people delivering it. Dr. Obi asked about the 612. What were they like? What did they want? What did they fear? The interface was not prepared for these questions. They were not on the protocol, but they were, apparently, answerable because the interface answered them. And in answering them, it told us things about the Veth-Kari that they had not intended to disclose, because no prior species had asked. Here is what we learned in those 6 hours and 47 minutes. The Veth-Kari were tired. Not in any biological sense, their physiology was not subject to fatigue in the way ours is, but in a way that Thunes, who had seen this in negotiation rooms his entire career, recognized immediately. They had been doing the same thing for 40,000 years. They had administered 612 species. Every one of those administrations had followed the same pattern: ultimatum, response, classification, oversight or containment, and then the next one, and then the next one. 40,000 years of the same pattern, and they had never, not once in 612 cases, encountered a species that asked them how they were doing, that asked them what the work was like, that treated the 24-hour ultimatum not as a threat to be responded to, but as an opening to a conversation that might go somewhere interesting. The Veth-Kari diplomatic interface in Hour 4 of the conversation said something that Dr. Obi later described as the most significant moment in the history of human diplomacy. It said, "You are not what we expected." And Thune said, "What did you expect?" And it said, "Compliance or defiance. Those are the options." And Dr. Obi said, "Those are two options. They are not all of them." And there was a silence that lasted 37 seconds, which is a very long silence in a conversation, and which all three of our people recognized as a significant moment even before they understood why. The 24 hours ran out while the conversation was still going. I monitored the clock from Relay Station 7, and when it hit 0, I held my breath the way everyone in every operations room and relay station and command post and living room on Earth and in every human installation off Earth held their breath. Nothing happened. The Veth-Kari fleet, which had been sitting at the edge of our system in perfect formation for the duration of the ultimatum, did not move, did not open fire, did not begin whatever process containment involved. It sat there, waiting, because the conversation was still going, and the Veth-Kari, it turned out, were willing to let the timeline lapse while a conversation was in progress, because in 612 administrations a conversation had never been in progress when the timeline lapsed. They did not have a protocol for this. They improvised. They allowed it to continue. This was, I have come to believe, the moment the whole thing turned. The conversation continued for another 9 hours past the deadline. Garrett finished his cheese sandwich sometime in Hour 3 and was brought another one, which detail the historical record does not include, but which I'm including here because I think it matters. Akafor called me from the operations room at some point in Hour 15 and said, "Are we winning?" And I said, "I do not think winning is the right frame." And he said, "Are we losing?" And I said, "I do not think that is the right frame either." And he said, "Then what frame is right?" And I thought about it for a moment. Then I said, "I think we are being ourselves at them." And there was a pause. Then he said, "Is that working?" And I said, "So far they have not contained us, so I think maybe yes." The Veth-Kari did not accept our surrender because we did not offer one. They did not contain us because, and this is the part that the official histories summarize in one paragraph and that deserves considerably more, the conversation changed something. Not in our position, in theirs. 40,000 years of administration, 612 species, all of them responding to the ultimatum in one of two ways. And then, for the first time in their recorded history of interspecies contact, a species that did neither. A species that asked them what the work was like. That wanted to know about the others. That treated them not as an authority to submit to or a threat to resist, but as something more complicated and more interesting than either of those things. 3 humans in a relay station with a cheese sandwich and 30 years of impossible negotiations, and a vocabulary of questions that the Veth-Kari had never been asked. The Veth-Kari, it emerged, had questions of their own. Questions they had been accumulating for 40,000 years and had never had an appropriate context to ask because all prior administrations had been resolved before any real conversation could develop. They wanted to know things about us. About why we were still here after the century we had just had. About how we rebuilt. About the laugh, which they had intercepted and analyzed and which they admitted. The interface actually used the word admitted. They had not been able to classify. Dr. Obi explained the laugh. She took a long time doing it because it was not a simple thing to explain, and she wanted to get it right. She said, "When you told us we had 24 hours, we heard something underneath what you said. We heard the assumption that the 24 hours was enough time for us to calculate our options and determine that submission was the best one. And what made us laugh was not that the assumption was wrong about the calculation. The calculation was probably correct. You have more power than we do in direct terms. What made us laugh was that the assumption missed the point of us. You looked at what we have and you told us to consider our options. And you did not account for the fact that we are a species that does not always choose what is best for us in direct terms. We choose what we can live with. And we could not live with surrender. Not because surrender was the worst outcome militarily, because it was the wrong story. And humans do not accept the wrong story, even when the wrong story is the one that makes mathematical sense. We laugh because someone has offered us a story we are not willing to be in, and we do not know how else to respond to that. The interface was quiet for a long time after this. Then it said, "We have administered 612 species. We have never before been told that a species refused our terms because they were the wrong story." And Thunes said, "How did the others decide?" And the interface said, "They calculated." And he said, "What did they calculate?" And it said, "Probability of successful resistance versus probability of successful compliance and long-term stability under oversight." And he said, "And they chose compliance because the probability was better." And it said, "In most cases, yes." And Thunes said, "That is because they were choosing between outcomes." And the interface said, "Yes." "What were you choosing between?" And he said, "We were not choosing between outcomes. We were choosing what kind of species we wanted to be." Those are different questions with different answers, and you have to know which question you are answering before the calculation makes any sense. The formal agreement, when it was eventually reached, was not called a surrender. It was not called an oversight arrangement. It was called, in the document that both parties signed at the end of 16 hours of conversation that had started with an ultimatum and ended somewhere neither side had anticipated, a mutual recognition of standing. The Veth-Kari recognized humanity as a species of independent standing within the galactic community. We recognized the Veth-Kari as a legitimate administrative authority in the sectors under their purview, which did not include ours, a boundary that was established clearly and in writing, and that both sides agreed to treat as the foundation of whatever came next. It was not a victory. It was not a defeat. It was the beginning of a relationship that has had its complications in the years since, and that will no doubt have more. Because complicated relationships are what happens when two things that do not fully understand each other decide to keep talking instead of resolving the question with force. I want to tell you what happened after. Not the diplomacy, that has been documented extensively and better than I can document it. What happened after in the operations room at Lunar Base Callaway, where I went when the relay station stood down, and where Akaffer was still on shift, and where the coffee was better than the relay station but still not good. He handed me a cup and we stood there for a while not saying anything, looking at the board that was no longer showing a countdown clock and was now showing the status indicators of 16 different monitoring systems that were all reading nominal, which was extraordinary. Which was, given where we had been 16 hours ago, the most extraordinary thing I had seen in my career. And Akaffer said, "You know what I keep thinking about?" And I said, "What?" And he said, "The laugh." He said, "I keep thinking about why I laughed, because it was not a rational response. A rational response would have been to assess the situation and respond appropriately, and I laughed instead. And I have been trying to figure out whether that was a mistake or whether it was the right thing. And I looked at the board for a while, and then I said, 'I think it was the right thing,'" he said. "Why?" And I said, "Because the laugh told them something the assessment could not. The assessment tells you what you have and what you face and what your options are. The laugh tells you what you are, and they needed to know what we are. Because what we are is the thing they did not have in their files. What we are is the part they could not calculate. And the laugh was the first word of the answer to the question they did not know they were asking, which was, what do you do with a species that will not fit in your categories? The answer starts with, you listen to them laugh, and then you figure out what comes next. And Akaffer was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That is the most words I have ever heard you use to explain a laugh." And I said, "It was a significant laugh." And he said, "Fair enough." And we drank the not good coffee and the board read nominal, and outside the windows of lunar base Callaway the stars were exactly where they had always been, unchanged, indifferent, and ours to figure out on our own terms, which was the only way we had ever wanted them. At hour 4 of the conversation, something happened that none of us in the relay station had anticipated and that the council briefing documents had not prepared us for. The Veth-Kari diplomatic interface asked a question, not a clarifying question about the terms, not a procedural question about the timeline or the format of a potential surrender document, a genuine question. It said, "Why did your species not collapse? We have the historical record." We reviewed it before initiating contact, as is standard. Your last century by our calculation should have produced civilizational termination by standard models. It did not. We do not have a satisfactory explanation for this in our files. Dr. Obi was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Which part specifically?" The interface said, "All of it. The disease events, the resource conflicts, the atmospheric destabilization, the economic contractions." By our models, any one of those individually would have produced a regression severe enough to set your development back by 2 to 3 centuries. You experienced all of them in sequence within a single century, and yet your technological development continued to accelerate. Your population stabilized. Your off-world presence expanded. We do not have a category for this outcome. And Dr. Obi said something that I have thought about every day since. She said, "We were angry." She said, "I know that is not the answer your models predict. I know anger is not a survival mechanism by standard biological definitions. But when things got bad, we did not give up. We got angry. We got angry at the disease and developed treatments faster than we had ever developed anything. We got angry at the resource conflicts and built energy systems that did not require the resources we were fighting over. We got angry at the atmospheric destabilization and spent 20 years redesigning the energy economy of the entire planet because we were not willing to accept that we had broken something we could not fix. Anger is not rational. I know that. But it is functional for us. When we cannot find a reason to continue in the calculation, we find one in the feeling. And the feeling that works best for us, the one that has gotten us through more impossible situations than any other, is not hope, though we have that too, and not courage, though we have that as well. It is the specific, unreasonable, totally irrational refusal to accept that this is how the story ends. We have been refusing that for 6,000 years. We will probably be refusing it for 6,000 more. The interface was silent for a long time. Then it said, "We do not have a word for this in our language," and Dr. Obi said, "We have several. Would you like to hear them?" Hour 7 brought the first genuine moment of what I can only call confusion from the Veth-Kari side. Until hour 7, the interface had been precise. Every response came quickly and in complete sentences that read like they had been constructed carefully before being transmitted. In hour 7, Dr. Obi asked a question that broke the pattern. She asked, "Do you ever get tired of it?" The interface said, "Please clarify the referent." She said, "The administering. The arriving and assessing and classifying and overseeing and containing. 612 times. Do you ever get tired of doing the same thing?" There was a pause before the response came, longer than the previous pauses. When it came, it was shorter than the previous responses. It said, "This is not a question we have been asked before." And Thunes, reading the pause the way he had read pauses in 30 years of negotiation rooms, said, "That is not an answer." And there was another pause. And then the interface said something that Dr. Obi later told me she had not expected and that she had spent the month since trying to understand the full implications of. It said, "The work is what it is. We do not evaluate it in the terms you are using." And she said, "Why not?" And it said, "Because we are the ones who do it." And she said, "That is a reason to evaluate it more, not less." And the interface did not respond for 41 seconds. 41 seconds is an extraordinarily long pause from a diplomatic interface that had been responding in under 5 for the previous 7 hours. In the 9th hour, Garrett put down his second cheese sandwich and spoke for the first time in 3 hours. He had been largely silent since the opening exchanges, which I had initially found odd because he was there specifically for adversarial communication. What I came to understand, watching the recording later, was that he was not silent because he had nothing to say. He was silent because he was reading the conversation the way a surgeon reads a body, looking for the place, waiting for the moment, not doing anything until the moment was right. In hour 9, the moment was right. He said, "I want to ask about the ones you contained, not the details of the containment. I want to ask what they were like before. Were they like us?" The interface said they were diverse. He said, "Diverse how?" It said, "In biology, in culture, in technological level." He said, "But in the specific quality that brought you here, were they like us?" The interface said, "Please clarify the quality you are referring to," and Garrett said, "The quality that made you give us 24 hours instead of just doing it, because you could have just done it. You have the capability. You gave us the clock because you thought we might surrender and you preferred that outcome. Why?" The interface paused. Then it said, "Compliance is preferable to containment for administrative reasons." And Garrett said, "Sure, but you could have led with containment and you did not. Why?" Another pause. Then, "Compliance indicates a species that has understood its situation." And Garrett said, "And containment indicates a species that has not." And the interface said, "Yes." And he said, "And you prefer the SEs that understands." And it said, "Yes." And he said, "Then you should know that we understand perfectly. We understand exactly what you have and what we have and what the math says. And we are still here having this conversation instead of surrendering. That means we understand something your math does not include. And I think if you are honest with yourselves, that is why you gave us the clock. Because something in your assessment told you we might be the kind of species that understands things your math does not include. And you wanted to find out." The interface did not respond to this for 4 minutes and 17 seconds. I know the exact duration because I was watching the clock on my board, and the silence was the kind that makes you watch clocks. When it responded, it said, "Your species is not what our preliminary assessment indicated." And Garrett said, "No," it said, "Our preliminary assessment was thorough." And he said, "I'm sure it was." It said, "We have done this 612 times." He said, "I know." It said, "The assessment was not wrong about the capabilities." He said, "I know." It said, "It was wrong about something else." And Garrett said, "Yes." And the interface said, "What was it wrong about?" And Garrett said, "It was wrong about what drives us. Your assessment measured what we have. It did not measure what we are willing to do with what we have when the alternative is being something we do not want to be. Those are not the same variable." And the interface said, "We have never before needed to measure that variable." And Garrett said, "Then maybe that is what this conversation is for." By hour 12, the tone of the exchanges had shifted in a way that was difficult to articulate but impossible to miss. The Veth-Kari interface was no longer responding in the precise, constructed sentences of the early hours. The responses were longer, less structured. In several instances, Dr. Obi noted that the interface seemed to be working something out in the process of responding rather than transmitting a completed thought. She noted this in her log as significant. I noted it from the relay station as the strangest thing I had observed in what was already the strangest 14 hours of my career. The most powerful administrative civilization in this sector of the galaxy was, if I read the communication patterns correctly, thinking out loud, in conversation with 3 humans and a cheese sandwich. Because we had asked them questions they had never been asked in 40,000 years. Not harder questions than they had faced before. Not more complex or more threatening. Just different. Just the questions of a species that had come into the conversation not to calculate but to understand, and in doing so had created the conditions for something that had not happened in 612 prior administrations. A real conversation. There is a thing that happens in a real conversation that does not happen in a negotiation, and does not happen in an ultimatum, and does not happen in any of the other structured forms of communication that species use when they are trying to get something from each other. In a real conversation, both sides change. Not necessarily in the big, visible ways. Not necessarily in the ways that show up in the formal agreements. but in the small ways that matter more in the long run. The way you see the thing on the other side of the table, the way you hold the question of what they are. By hour 12, the Veth-Kari interface had stopped speaking to us as a species to be classified. It was speaking to us as a species to be understood. These are different things. Classification ends the inquiry. Understanding continues it. Understanding requires you to remain open to being wrong about what you thought you knew, which is a posture that is very easy to lose when you have been right about 612 things in a row, and very hard to recover once you have lost it. We gave it back to them by being something their 612 data points had not accounted for. We gave it back to them by being ourselves. I want to tell you what the lesson is, not the diplomatic lesson, not the strategic lesson, not the lesson about how to respond to an alien ultimatum, which I hope you personally will never need. The lesson that matters is the one that applies to every room you have ever sat in when someone put a clock on you and told you what your options were. The lesson is, your options are never only the ones on their list. The Veth-Kari came to us with two options, surrender or be contained. Those were the only two outcomes in their protocol. They had 612 reference cases, and every single one had resolved into one of those two options. And then we came along and found a third one that was not on their list. Not because we had more power than the previous 612. We did not. Not because we had better technology or more resources or a stronger military position. We did not have any of those advantages either. We found the third option because we were not willing to accept that the list they brought was the complete list. We treated the list as a starting point for a conversation about what was actually possible rather than a boundary that defined what was allowed. That is not a diplomatic technique. That is not a strategic calculation. That is a way of being in the world that we have had for 6,000 years, and that has gotten us through things that should have ended us, repeatedly. And that will get us through the next thing too. The lesson I took from all of it, and I have had years to think about it, years in which people have asked me what I think we should take away from the 43 hours that started with an alien ultimatum and ended with a mutual recognition of standing, is this. The Veth-Kari were not wrong about our capabilities. They assessed correctly. They saw what we had and they made a reasonable determination about what we could do. Where they were wrong was in assuming that what we could do was the thing that would determine what we chose. They did not understand that for us, capability and choice are not the same question. They had administered 612 species who answered the question of what they would do by first calculating what they could do. We answered the question differently. We asked what we were willing to be. That is a different question. It has a different answer. And it took 16 hours of conversation and one cheese sandwich and a laugh that no prior species had produced to communicate the difference. But we communicated it, because that is what we do. We find the way to communicate what we are even when the other side does not have a framework for receiving it. We find it because we are not willing to be something we are not, and we are not willing to be silent about it. And we are not willing to accept that the only options are the ones on someone else's list. We never have been. We never will be. If you have ever laughed at something that was supposed to make you afraid, you already understand this. If you have ever looked at the clock someone else put on your life and decided you were going to do it your way regardless, you already understand this. The aliens gave us 24 hours to become something we were not. We spent 16 of them explaining what we were. That was always the right move. That was always the only move. The clock was never the point. The point was always who we were when it ran out. Let me tell you about HFY one more time, because he deserves more than the laugh at the beginning and the question at the end. HFY had been in the operations room for 19 straight hours by the time the formal agreement was signed. He had watched the clock run out and watched nothing happen. He had watched the boards the whole time, reading the signals the way he had been trained to read them, looking for the things that would tell him whether we were about to be contained, and what that would mean in practical terms for lunar base Callaway, and for the Earth below it. And for the 4 billion people who did not know in any detail what was happening in the relay stations and the operations rooms, but who were aware in the general way that everyone was aware that something significant was going on. He had done his job for 19 hours without sleep and without complaint and without anything except the not good coffee and the professional discipline of a man who understood that the job was the job and you did it. When I got back to the operations room after the relay station stood down, he was still there. He handed me the coffee. He said, "So." And I said, "So." He said, "We are not contained." I said, "We are not contained." He said, "The agreement is real." I said, "As real as anything gets at the end of 16 hours of conversation with a diplomatic interface that did not expect to be having the conversation it had." He nodded. He looked at the board for a while. Then he said, "The laugh." I said, "What about it?" He said, "Do you think that was the thing that changed it?" And I thought about the whole 16 hours. The questions and the pauses and Garrett and the cheese sandwich and Dr. Obi explaining the wrong story and Thunes and the 30 years of impossible negotiations and the 41-second silence in hour 7. And I said, "I think the laugh was the first sentence of a very long answer to a question they did not know how to ask." He thought about this. Then he said, "What was the question?" And I said, "What are you? What are you exactly? What kind of thing is this that we are dealing with?" That was the question. And the laugh was the first word of the answer. And the next 15 hours and 47 minutes were the rest of it. The Veth-Kari sent a final communication 48 hours after the agreement was signed. It was not a diplomatic communication. It was not addressed to the council or to the diplomatic team. It was addressed specifically and by name to Dr. Yusra Obi, who had asked them what the work was like and had listened to the answer. The communication said, in the language they had been developing jointly over the course of the 16-hour conversation, "We have administered 612 species. We have reached agreement with 611 of them, either through compliance or through containment. You are the 612th. You are the first one we reached agreement with in a third way. We do not have a word for the third way in our language. We have been trying to find one. The closest we have is a word that translates approximately as an outcome that changes the category system rather than fitting into it. We think this is accurate. We think this is what happened. We will be watching. We think watching you will continue to be instructive." Dr. Obi read this 3 times before she responded. Her response was 4 words. She said, "We will be interesting." The Veth-Kari did not reply to this, but the monitoring systems at Relay Station 7 picked up in the frequency ranges that the Veth-Kari fleet used for internal communications, a burst of activity in the minutes following the transmission that the analysts described as unusually high for a fleet at rest. No one could tell us what it meant. Some of the analysts thought it was administrative processing. Some thought it was a tactical assessment. Garrett, who had been brought in to review the data, listened to the recording for a long time. Then he said, "I think it might be laughter," and no one in the room said anything for a moment. And then someone laughed, and then someone else did. And it spread the way laughter does, which is to say completely and without permission. And for a moment the analysts at Relay Station 7 and the team at the operations room at Lunar Base Callaway and the diplomatic unit that had spent 16 hours changing the category system laughed together in different rooms on the same small moon. And outside the windows the stars were where they had always been, and the Veth-Kari fleet was beginning slowly to move away. And whatever came next was ours to figure out, which was, when you got down to it, exactly how we had always wanted it. Drop that one word in the comments, whatever hit you. I am reading every single one. The next story on this channel is nothing like this one, different voice, different format, different angle entirely. That is the point of this channel. Every story is its own thing. Every episode is a different window into what it means to be the species the galaxy could not categorize. Subscribe to UG Human HFY. We are just getting started.